I still remember the exact moment my father-in-law decided I was beneath him. It happened in front of nearly 50 people, under crystal chandeliers worth more than my annual salary. Inside the mansion everyone in town called the Whitmore estate. "Emily," Richard Whitmore said loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear. "Tell everyone about your exciting career. You still skin cereal boxes and bag groceries, right?" The room erupted in polite laughter. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others smiled into their wine glasses. I felt every stare land on me at once. I could have explained that I actually enjoyed my job. I could have explained that working at a neighborhood grocery store helped me stay connected to real people instead of living inside a bubble of wealth and status. But I already knew it would not matter. To Richard Whitmore, a person's worth was measured by the size of their bank account. I smiled and answered calmly, "Yes, I work at Green Valley Market." Richard leaned back in his chair and shook his head dramatically. "Amazing. My landscaper makes more money than some grocery clerks." More laughter followed. My husband, Daniel, sat beside me and forced a nervous smile instead of defending me. That hurt more than Richard's joke. The Whitmore family had spent years treating me like an outsider. Their mansion sat on nearly 20 acres overlooking a private lake outside Asheville, North Carolina. They owned luxury cars, vacation homes, and enough investments to make local newspapers pay attention whenever they hosted a charity event. And yet no amount of money seemed enough for them. They always needed someone to look down on. That someone was usually me. As dinner continued, Richard stood and tapped his glass. The room grew quiet. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said proudly. "Next spring, we're beginning the largest expansion project in Whitmore family history." A giant screen lit up behind him, displaying architectural renderings of new guest houses, gardens, and entertainment spaces. Guests applauded. Richard looked like a king presenting his kingdom. "When it's complete," he continued, "this estate will remain in our family for generations." Everyone cheered again. Then his eyes shifted toward me. "Assuming certain people don't bring down property values." More laughter. I felt my face grow warm, but I refused to react. Richard wanted a reaction. He wanted embarrassment. Instead, I quietly sipped my water and watched him celebrate. What nobody in that room knew was that life had taught me something Richard never learned. The loudest person in the room is not always the most powerful. Sometimes the most powerful person is the one nobody bothers to notice. As the applause filled the mansion, I glanced through the massive windows toward the dark land stretching beyond the estate grounds. Richard Whitmore stood there boasting about a future he believed he controlled. He had no idea that within a few weeks, a single piece of paper would change everything he thought he knew about his family, his mansion, and me. The next morning, I was back at Green Valley Market by 7 o'clock, stocking shelves and helping customers find everything from coffee filters to pet food. That was the funny thing about my life. One minute, I was sitting inside a mansion worth millions of dollars being judged by people who barely knew me. And the next, I was helping an elderly customer reach a box of oatmeal from the top shelf. Honestly, I preferred the grocery store. People there cared more about kindness than status. Around noon, my friend and coworker Lisa noticed I seemed distracted. "Another Whitmore family event?" she asked. I laughed softly. "Am I that obvious?" She nodded. "Every time you visit them, you come back looking like you ran a marathon." She was not wrong. For the past 6 years, the Whitmores had treated me like a temporary inconvenience. Richard never missed an opportunity to remind everyone that I came from a middle-class family. His wife, Victoria, was more subtle, but somehow worse. She specialized in compliments that were not really compliments. She would say things like, "Emily, it is admirable that you are comfortable living such a simple life." Or, "Not everyone is meant for big opportunities." The words sounded polite until you understood what she really meant. Even Daniel had slowly changed over the years. When we first met, he admired my independence. He liked that I worked hard and never cared about appearances. But after spending enough time around his family, he started measuring success the same way they did. Bigger house, more expensive car, higher social status. That evening, Daniel called while I was driving home. "My father wants everyone at the estate next Saturday," he said. "Why?" I asked. "He is hosting investors for the expansion project." I could already hear the excitement in his voice. "Emily, this project is huge. They are adding guest houses, private event spaces, walking trails, everything." I kept my eyes on the road. "Sounds expensive. Daniel laughed. For my family? Not really. A few seconds later, he added, you should probably wear something a little more formal this time. I knew exactly what he meant. He was embarrassed by me, not because of who I was, but because I reminded his family that not everyone measured life in dollars. After we hung up, I pulled into the small driveway of the house I had inherited from my grandfather years ago. It was modest, quiet, and fully paid for. As I walked to the mailbox, I noticed a large envelope stamped with the logo of a law firm I did not recognize. The return address was in Charlotte. I frowned and carried it inside. For a moment, I considered opening it immediately, but I set it on the kitchen counter instead. Legal letters usually meant paperwork, taxes, or documents nobody wanted to read. I had no idea that envelope contained the first piece of a story that had begun decades before I was born, a story that would soon collide with the Whitmore family in a way none of us could have imagined. The next evening, curiosity finally got the better of me. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened the envelope from the law firm. Inside were several pages of legal documents along with a letter signed by an attorney named Michael Reeves. The first paragraph immediately caught my attention. It referenced my grandfather, Thomas Carter, who had passed away nearly 8 years earlier. My grandfather had been one of the quietest people I had ever known. He drove the same pickup truck for 20 years, wore old work boots until they practically fell apart, and never talked about money. Growing up, I spent countless weekends with him. We fished in small ponds, repaired fences, and shared simple dinners on his back porch. He always told me that land was different from money. Money could disappear overnight, but land had a way of staying important long after people stopped paying attention to it. At the time, I thought he was just sharing old-fashioned wisdom. As I continued reading, I learned that the law firm had been conducting a review of several trust records connected to properties my grandfather once owned. Certain ownership documents had recently been updated and verified through county records. The language was complicated, filled with legal terms I barely understood, but one sentence stood out. The attorneys requested a meeting to discuss assets connected to the Carter Family Trust. Assets, plural. That surprised me. As far as I knew, my grandfather had left me only the small house where I lived. I reread the letter twice before setting it down. Something about it felt important, though I could not explain why. The following morning, life returned to normal. Customers came and went through Green Valley Market. I stocked shelves, helped unload deliveries, and chatted with regular shoppers. Meanwhile, social media was filled with photos from the Whitmore family. Richard had already started promoting his expansion project. Local business leaders praised his vision. Articles described the estate as one of the most prestigious private properties in western North Carolina. Every headline seemed to make him even more confident. A few days later, Daniel invited me to dinner with his parents again. The moment I arrived, Richard launched into another speech about the future of the estate. He showed everyone new architectural drawings and talked about private guest cottages, luxury gardens, and exclusive events. Investors surrounded him, nodding approvingly. This property will be the crown jewel of the region, Richard declared. Everything you see here will remain under Whitmore control for generations. The confidence in his voice was absolute. Not once did he speak as if anything could ever threaten his plans. Not once did he consider the possibility that there were facts about the property he did not know. As I listened from the edge of the room, I remembered my grandfather's words about land. For reasons I could not explain, they suddenly felt more significant than ever. Then, just as the evening was winding down, my phone vibrated. It was a voicemail notification from Michael Reeves. I stepped outside onto the terrace and pressed play. His message was short, professional, and impossible to ignore. He said the trust review had uncovered information requiring my immediate attention and asked me to schedule a meeting as soon as possible. Standing there beneath the lights of the estate, I had no idea that the answers waiting in those records were connected to the very ground beneath my feet. 2 days later, I drove to Charlotte for my meeting with Michael Reeves. His office occupied the 20th floor of a glass building overlooking downtown, the kind of place that made me feel slightly underdressed no matter what I wore. Michael greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room where several folders had already been arranged on the table. After a few minutes of introductions, he opened one of the folders and slid a collection of documents toward me. "Emily, before we begin, I need to ask a simple question," he said. How much did your grandfather tell you about his real estate holdings? I almost laughed. Very little. He owned my house, and that is about all I know. Michael exchanged a glance with another attorney before looking back at me. That is what we suspected. For the next hour, he explained that my grandfather had accumulated several parcels of land over decades. Most had been sold long ago. Others had been transferred into a trust. The trust itself had remained largely dormant because certain legal reviews were never completed after his death. Recently, a county records modernization project uncovered documentation that required the trust to be updated. I listened carefully, trying to make sense of everything. Then Michael placed a map on the table. Several highlighted sections appeared across the county. One particular area caught my attention because it looked strangely familiar. I narrowed my eyes and leaned closer. Wait, I said. I know that location. Michael nodded. Yes, we thought you might. My stomach tightened. The highlighted parcel sat near the lake outside Asheville. Very near. In fact, it appeared to overlap with land surrounding the Whitmore estate. Before I could ask more questions, Michael raised a hand. Please understand, we are still verifying historical records. Nothing is final yet. However, there are strong indications that your grandfather retained ownership interests connected to this parcel through the trust. Ownership interests. The phrase echoed in my mind. Michael continued explaining legal procedures, surveys, and title reviews, but I found myself staring at the map. Meanwhile, back in Asheville, Richard's expansion project was accelerating. Over the following week, local newspapers ran glowing stories about the future development. Investors toured the property. Architects visited regularly. Every update made the project sound larger and more expensive than before. At another family gathering, Richard proudly described plans for luxury guest residences, private event venues, and landscaped walking paths stretching across acres of land. This property is the foundation of our legacy, he announced. Everything starts with the land. The irony nearly made me smile. Later that night, Daniel repeated many of his father's comments during our drive home. He sounded impressed, inspired, almost determined to prove himself worthy of the Whitmore name. I remained quiet, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I still did not know exactly what the documents meant. All I knew was that lawyers were reviewing records connected to the very area Richard considered untouchable. A few days later, Michael called again. His tone was professional, but noticeably more serious. Emily, he said, the title researchers have completed another phase of their review. We need you back in Charlotte. There is something important you need to see. When I returned to Charlotte, Michael Reeves looked far less cautious than he had during our previous meetings. Several additional folders sat on the conference table, along with enlarged survey maps and copies of decades-old property records. As soon as I sat down, he pushed a document toward me. The title review is nearly complete, he said, and the results are remarkable. For the next 40 minutes, he walked me through a chain of ownership stretching back more than 60 years. My grandfather had purchased a large tract of undeveloped land near the lake long before the area became desirable. Over time, portions were sold, transferred, or incorporated into different agreements. However, one critical section remained inside the Carter family trust. The section had been overlooked for years because of outdated records and administrative errors that nobody thought to revisit until the recent review. I studied the maps carefully. The highlighted parcel sat directly beneath a portion of the area surrounding the Whitmore estate. My pulse quickened. Are you telling me my grandfather still owned part of that land? I asked. Michael folded his hands. What I am telling you is that current evidence strongly suggests the trust retained ownership rights that were never legally extinguished. Final verification is still pending, but the documentation is becoming very difficult to dispute. I left the office feeling overwhelmed. For days afterward, I carried copies of the maps in my bag and reread them whenever I had a spare moment. At the grocery store, customers chatted about weekend plans while my mind drifted back to legal surveys and trust records. Meanwhile, Richard's expansion project continued gathering momentum. Newspaper articles described the development as a transformational investment for the region. Construction consultants visited the estate almost daily. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel convinced me to attend another planning event hosted by his parents. The moment we arrived, I could feel the familiar atmosphere. Wealthy guests gathered around displays showing future buildings and landscaped grounds. Richard stood at the center of the crowd, proudly explaining every detail. This project is already attracting major interest, he announced. Nothing is going to stop it. Several people applauded. Then his attention shifted toward me. Emily, he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. I hope your grocery store schedule leaves enough time to appreciate what real success looks like. A few guests laughed politely. I simply smiled and remained silent. What surprised me most was how little his words affected me now. For years, comments like that had embarrassed me. But sitting in Michael's office had changed something. For the first time, I realized how little Richard actually knew about the foundations supporting the life he was so proud of. Later that evening, as guests prepared to leave, I noticed surveyors walking portions of the property with clipboards and equipment. Richard enthusiastically described future construction zones and expansion boundaries. He spoke with complete certainty, yet every time he pointed toward a section of land, I found myself wondering whether he understood the history beneath it. 2 days later, Michael called again. His voice carried a level of confidence I had not heard before. Emily, he said, the final verification has arrived. Of the trust, the ownership rights belong to me. I stared at the map. The highlighted section was no longer a vague outline near the Whitmore estate. It was clearly identified. My heartbeat quickened as I traced the boundaries with my finger. The parcel covered a substantial portion of the land supporting the estate's expansion plans. More importantly, it included sections that investors believed were already under Whitmore control. Could notice my expression. He truly believed that. He had no idea that attorneys in Charlotte were preparing formal notices. He had no idea that survey records, trust documents, and expression barely changed. Then his eyes moved more quickly across the pages. He stopped speaking entirely. Victoria stepped closer. Richard, she asked. He did not answer. Several investors exchanged nervous glances. Finally, one of the consultants asked the question everyone was thinking. Is there a problem? Michael addressed the room. There is a matter involving ownership rights connected to portions of the land included within the proposed development area. Richard immediately interrupted. This is ridiculous. We own this property. Michael nodded respectfully. You own certain portions. However, recent title verification confirmed that a critical parcel remains under the ownership of the Carter Family Trust. Silence spread through the room. I could practically feel people trying to process what they had just heard. Richard looked genuinely stunned for the first time since I had known him. That cannot be correct, he said. The records have been reviewed extensively, Michael replied. The findings have been independently verified. One investor raised his hand. Who controls the trust? The room became completely silent. Michael turned toward me. Dozens of heads followed his gaze. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Michael answered the question. Emily Carter is the sole beneficiary and controlling owner. I watched disbelief spread across faces throughout the room. The same people who had laughed at my grocery store job now stared at me as though they were seeing me for the first time. Daniel looked frozen. Victoria appeared unable to speak. Richard simply stood there holding the folder, surrounded by maps and development plans that suddenly seemed far less certain than they had only minutes earlier. And for the first time in years, nobody in the room was laughing. The atmosphere inside the estate changed instantly. Only minutes earlier, investors had been discussing timelines and expansion budgets. Now small groups stood whispering to one another while attorneys reviewed documents and consultants studied maps with growing concern. Richard remained near the stage, staring at the folder as though reading it repeatedly might produce a different outcome. For the first time since I had met him, he looked uncertain. Not angry, not arrogant, simply uncertain. Daniel approached me first. Emily, why did you not tell me? He asked quietly. I looked at him for a moment before answering. Because I did not know until recently. He seemed to search for words, but could not find any. Around us, people continued talking in low voices. Investors who had once surrounded Richard were now speaking directly with attorneys. Questions about permits, ownership rights, and development schedules filled the room. Every answer seemed to create new concerns. Eventually, Richard walked toward me. The confident smile he usually wore was gone. Emily, he began carefully. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. I almost laughed at the sudden change in tone. For years, he had never cared about private conversations when criticizing me in front of others. Now privacy suddenly mattered. There is nothing private about what happened today, I replied calmly. Richard glanced around before lowering his voice. Surely we can work something out. Those words stayed with me because they revealed something important. He was no longer speaking to me as the daughter-in-law he considered beneath him. He was speaking to someone whose cooperation he needed. Over the next several days, the situation became the talk of the community. Local business circles learned that ownership questions had emerged around key portions of the proposed development. Nobody knew every detail, but everyone knew enough to understand that the project was no longer guaranteed. Meanwhile, something even more surprising happened. People who had barely acknowledged me for years suddenly became friendly. Victoria called twice to invite me to lunch. Several Whitmore relatives reached out with messages asking how I was doing. One cousin even described me as an important part of the family. The change was so dramatic that it almost felt comical. Yet I did not feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. Their behavior confirmed what I had suspected for years. Respect that depends on power is not really respect at all. A week later, Michael informed me that representatives connected to the development wanted to meet. They hoped to discuss options, agreements, and future access to portions of the land. Legally, I had every right to refuse. The trust records were clear. The ownership rights were valid. For the first time, every major decision rested with me rather than Richard. That evening, I sat alone on the porch of the small house my grandfather had left me. I thought about the lessons he taught me when I was young. He never bragged about what he owned. He never judged people by their jobs. He believed character mattered more than appearances. Looking back, I realized that the greatest inheritance he left me was not the land. It was the ability to remain calm when other people measured worth by the wrong things. And as requests for meetings continued arriving, I began considering a decision that would determine not only the future of the project, but also the future of my relationship with the Whitmore family. The final meeting took place nearly a month later inside a conference room overlooking downtown Charlotte. Representatives from the development project were there, along with attorneys, consultants, and members of the Whitmore family. Richard looked older than I remembered, not because of time, but because certainty had finally left him. For years, he had built his identity around control. Now he sat across from me waiting for a decision he could not make himself. The meeting began with presentations, legal summaries, and proposed agreements. Various options were discussed. Some would allow portions of the project to continue. Others would require significant redesigns. Everyone in the room understood the same reality. Nothing moved forward without my approval. Documents in front of me. Months earlier, I might have imagined this moment very differently. I might have imagined anger, revenge, or public humiliation. But sitting there, I realized none of those things would improve my life. The people who had underestimated me had already revealed something important about themselves. They had shown me exactly how they viewed others. I did not need to punish them. Reality had already done that. I took a slow breath and explained my decision. I was willing to authorize a limited agreement that allowed certain portions of the project to proceed under fair legal terms. However, I would not transfer ownership. The trust would remain intact. The land would remain under my control. Most importantly, I would no longer participate in relationships built on disrespect. The room remained silent as my words settled in. Richard nodded slowly. There was disappointment in his expression, but also something else. Acceptance. For perhaps the first time in his life, he understood that wealth could not buy every outcome. After the meeting ended, Daniel asked if we could talk privately. We walked outside together. He apologized for the times he failed to stand beside me when I needed support. His voice sounded sincere, and I appreciated that. But apologies do not erase years of choices. They simply acknowledge them. We parted on respectful terms, each moving toward a different future. Over the following months, life became surprisingly peaceful. I continued working at Green Valley Market because I genuinely enjoyed it. Customers still asked for help finding products. Children still waved when they recognized me in the aisles. Nothing about my daily routine required luxury or status to feel meaningful. Occasionally, I would drive past the estate and see construction crews working on revised plans. The project moved forward, just not in the way Richard originally imagined. And every time I passed that land, I thought about my grandfather. He never taught me how to become wealthy. He taught me something far more valuable. He taught me that character matters when nobody thinks you have power. In the end, the greatest victory was never about ownership, money, or property rights. It was discovering that my worth had never depended on what anyone else thought of me.